You know, everyone in our country knows who Billy Graham is. No doubt you know who Billy Graham is. You've heard of him. Billy Graham has been called the greatest preacher of the last generation, possibly even the greatest this country has ever seen. He's spoken to millions of people around the world about the message of Jesus. And when anyone talks about what a devout Christian is like, or someone they know who really devoted their lives to Jesus, Billy Graham's always at the top of the list, or near the top, right along with people like Mother Teresa. But almost no one has ever heard of a man named Charles Templeton. My guess is you've never heard of Charles Templeton. Charles Templeton started out as Billy Graham's right-hand man. I mean, they were partners. They started out in ministry together. They would preach together. In fact, a lot of people predicted that Charles Templeton would become an even more famous and more powerful preacher than Billy Graham ever would. He was about the best there was. But you've never heard of Charles Templeton. And the reason you've never heard of Charles Templeton is because at one point in his life, he had a crisis of faith. In fact, eventually he would turn away from God. He walked away from the church, walked away from Christianity, and mostly he did it for one reason. He wrote a book. It's titled Farewell to God, and in his book, he wrote these words. I want you to see them. He says, "A loving God could not possibly be the author of the horrors that we have been describing. Horrors that continue every day, have continued since time began, and will continue as long as life exists. It's an inconceivable tale of suffering and death. And because the tale, in fact, is in truth the history of the world, it is obvious there cannot be a loving God." You know, one of the reasons that we decided to do this series of talks is because we wanted to talk about the biggest questions. We wanted to deal with the biggest misconceptions or biggest obstacles that people have to faith in God or the Bible or Christianity. And I just tell you, out of all the objections, out of all the questions that we're going to tackle, this one is probably, to me, the biggest. I've heard this question more than any other question that when I talk to people who have questions about faith or objections to Christianity, I hear this question probably more than any other question. In fact, this is the question that I hear a lot from people who are Christians, who do have faith in God. Mainly because this one is not only difficult to get your brain around, this one is very emotional. It's gut-wrenching, in fact. If there's a loving God, why? Why do we see and experience so much pain, so much suffering in our world? And I'll just be the first one to confess, and I'll say this right up front. As someone who, admittedly, I firmly believe the Bible, I firmly believe in God, I believe that Jesus Christ is the one and only resurrected Son of God, I struggle with this question. I wrestle with it. And not just on an intellectual kind of level. This for me goes way past that. It's beyond intellectual now. It's an emotional thing because see, I'm just like you. I've experienced tragedy in my life. I've seen pain. I've felt it. I know what it's like to grieve. I know what it's like to mourn. And I'm not saying that my pain is worse than your pain. I mean, I know there are people listening, watching me today, and you could tell a story that would far outweigh any of the stories that I could tell or anybody even in the room that you're in right now. I mean, my point is this. I don't approach this subject today as somebody who's detached emotionally from it. And I would never discount anything that you've ever been through. In fact, I know this is why some of you showed up here today. Because you're right in the center of some of this. You're going through a tragedy, or you're experiencing something like this, or you just have questions about this. And a friend of yours told you, hey, my church is going to talk about this question, and why don't you come and see? And so you showed up, and you're looking for answers, and you want to hear about it today. And you don't want to hear answers that trivialize what you've been through or what you're going through, or answers that shame you for questioning God, or for being mad at God, or for just even having the question in the first place. So I don't want to do that today. In fact, I'm going to do my best not to do any of that, and I hope you'll stick with me because I don't want that to be the case. In the best way that I know how, I just want to give you some things to think about, things that maybe will help you with some of the questions that you're struggling with, that we all struggle with, me included. And at the end, I also want to leave you with a little bit of hope to cling to, because there's one thing that I've been convinced of. First is that we all experience pain. I mean, pain is no respecter of persons. And when bad things happen, when we hurt, when we suffer, more than we need answers to our questions, we just need some hope. So I want to start with the questions, and then we'll move through this together. So let's get right at it. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is there so much suffering in this world? Now, whenever anyone asks a question, especially this question, but really any kind of question, there's often something behind the question. There's often an assumption that gets made. There's often things that go into the question itself. And I think this is one of those as well. I think there's a question behind this question that I think we ought to get at first. And it's something like this. If there is a God, and He's all-loving, and He's all-powerful, then when bad things happen in this world, then we got a few problems with that. Because, see, either God really is loving, and He wants to see evil defeated, He wants to see suffering ended, but for whatever reason, He can't. In that case, well, God's not very powerful, is He? In fact, He's pretty weak. Or, on the other hand, God can do something about evil in this world. He is powerful to do it, but He chooses not to. In that case, at the very least, God's not too loving. At the very worst, He might just be evil Himself. So when somebody stands up like me and tells you, God is all loving, God is perfect, God has all knowledge, God has all power, and then you walk out the door and something tragic happens, or you see atrocities in our world like the stuff you've already seen today in our service, and you think to yourself, now both of those things can't be true at the same time. So I think this question that we're asking today, why do bad things happen? It's really not a question about what happens on our planet here on Earth. I think this question is really about God. Who is He? I mean, can I trust God as all-powerful and all-loving when I still live in a world like this? So, I want to talk about those two aspects of God. The first one, let's talk about it. Is God really all-powerful? Is He? Now, there's something that you have to think about when you ask a question like that. And you have to ask this anytime you ask a question. You have to define the question. When you ask the question, is God all-powerful, you really have to say, well, what does it mean to be all-powerful? I mean, what is that like? And is that what we're exactly what are we dealing with here? Now, when most people say that God is all-powerful, what they usually mean is, well, God can do absolutely anything. And I would have to agree with that statement, but at the same time, there have to be qualifiers to it. That's really not the case. And I know it sounds weird for me to say that. It's like, well, he's contradicting himself. And I get that. I totally understand. But think about it. Because if God is all-powerful, because He's all-powerful, there have to be some things that God can't do. You think, well, what would that be? Well, give you a couple examples. For example, God can't contradict Himself. In other words, God can't make mistakes if He's all-powerful. Here's another one. God cannot cease to exist. I mean, if you're all-powerful, you can't just make yourself, I mean, He can't cease to exist. That's who He is. He's eternal. He can't cease to exist. Here's another one. God can't, and these are funny, but they're trivial, but God can't make 2 + 2 = 5. God can't make a round square. And the answer to the eternal question? No. God cannot make a rock so big that He can't move it. Now, here's what all of that means. Here's the implications to all of that. When God created human beings, He had two choices. God could have created a world without the possibility of evil ever existing, but at the same time that He does that, He would also have to take away our ability to choose between good and evil. The other choice God had, He could give human beings a free will to do what they want, to choose how they want. But if He does that, along with that, there has to be at least the possibility for us to choose evil rather than good. My point is, you cannot have one without the other. Even God could not have created one without the other. See, a lot of people get this confused. A lot of people think God created evil, or they use that as an argument. God didn't create evil. God didn't create suffering. But what God did create was the possibility for suffering, for evil, when he created human beings with the ability to choose their own destiny. See, because without that choice, we'd all cease to be human. We'd all become like robots programmed to do whatever God wanted us to do. And see, if that were the case, there'd be no such thing as love. Love requires that there be a choice by free will. Love requires choice. So the truth about that question is, yes, God is all-powerful. He can do anything that is possible to do. But when it comes to the evil that we experience in our world, if God were to completely remove the evil in our world, he would have to destroy part of us. He would have to take away our freedom to choose. He would have to eliminate the entire concept of love. And the world that we live in would immediately become a place that, honestly, none of us would want to live in. And you and I would immediately become something that we would never want to be in the first place. We'd be incapable of choice. We'd be incapable of love. Now let's get to the other question. Is God all loving? Now, think about it this way. If God really does love us the way we say he does, then, okay, why can't he just step in when it's necessary? Why can't God just reach down when a tragedy is about to happen and at least take away some of the suffering, take away some of the tragedy? Why doesn't he at least protect people when they need to be protected? And I'll just say, I totally get this. I totally agree with you on that question. It is very, very hard for us to understand why things like random weather, hurricanes, floods take the lives of innocent people, or why a child ends up getting cancer and dies. I mean, why accidents take place and people get hurt or people get maimed or even killed. And it's not like it was somebody's fault. It was just something that happened. It wasn't an evil choice that caused it. It was just a random thing. And we often sit back and wonder, man, if God could have stopped that, if he really loves us, why didn't he do it? Why didn't he just step in? Now, one thing that, as we try to answer that question, one of the things you have to admit right at the beginning, and I almost hate to even say this because when I say it, it's going to be so emotionally unsatisfying to you, and I get that. It's the same way for me. But you have to admit, because we are who we are, and because God is who he is, there are some things that are always going to have to be completely impossible for us to comprehend. I mean, when you think about this honestly, you kind of know it has to be this way, right? I mean, for God to truly be God, for him to be this eternal being who sees everything from eternity past all the way into eternity future, knowing everything there is to know, inevitably there are going to be things about life and about reality that you and I, in our limited capacity, are never going to be able to comprehend or understand. I mean, we can't see things with perfect clarity or perfect perspective the way God sees. So I want to say that just to make that point. Sometimes there are no answers that ever completely make sense. And I think maybe this is one of them. But I will try to give you a little perspective on it, and I'll give you an illustration to help you think about it. And before I even do that, I have to say, no illustration is perfect. Nothing is completely adequate. It's always going to fall short. But it helps me to think of it in these terms. And I want you to think about it this way. Imagine a father who has a daughter. He brings his daughter into the world. And he just makes the decision at the very beginning, I will never allow my daughter to be hurt. My daughter will never experience pain. She'll never experience any kind of suffering. As her father, I will take care of that. I will protect her from every harm that exists in this world. Now, if a father made that decision, what would that father have to do? Well, several things. First, he could never allow his daughter as an infant to walk. Because to allow her to walk also means he allows her the potential to fall. And the potential to fall means that she could be hurt and she could experience pain. So a father who is determined to never allow his daughter to feel pain has to carry her everywhere she goes. So she would never learn to walk. She would always be dependent on her father to go everywhere she went. Another thing that he would have to do is he would have to protect her from ever getting sick, which means she could never come in contact with any kind of germs, which means she could never come in contact with another human being. So she'd have to remain isolated. She could never have her heart broken, which means she could never have a relationship. Because in relationship, there's always the potential to be hurt. There's always a potential to get betrayed. So this father would essentially have to raise his daughter who is incapable of being a healthy, independent adult if all of those things took place. And see, you know this already. We all know that the best thing for a father to do for his daughter is to let her go. Allow her to stand up. Allow her to walk, even though there's a potential for her to be hurt, even if she falls. Give her the chance to relate to people, even if those people might break her heart. In fact, you and I know that the most loving thing for a father to do is to allow those possibilities to exist. In fact, if I were to present that picture to you, if I were to show you a father who had treated his daughter that way her whole life, you would call that father a child abuser. You'd say he was torturing her. And it's the same reason that every parent I know eventually will give their child a set of keys and watch them drive away. Because you know that at any moment, due to their choices, or even due to the choices of somebody they don't even know yet, somebody completely detached from the situation, they could get hurt. They could be in an accident. We know that if we hold our child back forever, we're being an unloving parent. Now, my point is, in some small way, I think that illustrates the way God chooses to relate to us. See, I think God has a much higher purpose for our lives than just making us pain-free and making us comfortable all the time. In fact, I would go this far. I would even say that if suffering didn't exist in our world, it would actually stand in the way of God's ultimate purpose for us. If there weren't suffering, we couldn't become what God wants us to be. In fact, I'll give you another way to think about this. And maybe you've never thought of it this way. There's a philosopher. His name is John Hick, and he writes about this whole idea. And I can't say it any better than him, so I'm just going to read you what he wrote and how he puts it. Here's his scenario. He says, suppose this world were a paradise from which all possibility of pain and suffering were excluded. The consequences would be far-reaching. For example, no one could ever injure anyone else. The murderer's knife would turn to paper, or his bullets to thin air. The bank safe, robbed of $1 million, would miraculously become filled with another $1 million. Imagine what that would do to inflation. Fraud, deceit, conspiracy, treason would somehow always leave the fabric of society undamaged. No one would ever be injured by accident. The mountain climber or the playing child falling from a height would float unharmed to the ground. The reckless driver would never meet with disaster. There'd be no need to work. There'd be no call to be concerned for others in time of need or danger, for in such a world there could be no real needs or dangers. And he goes on and he continues to describe it, and he talks about how the world we know it would completely change. For example, the law of gravity that right now is saving your life. I mean, the law of gravity is what's keeping you on this planet. I mean, as the planet spins, you don't fly off into space. That's because the law of gravity is predictable, and it holds you to this planet. That same law of gravity is the same thing that actually causes someone to be killed or harmed when they fall. So if the law of gravity, if there were no harm, there was never any harm done in our world, then anytime someone fell, the law of gravity would immediately have to be suspended, and it would have to stop working so that that person wouldn't fall to the ground. In a world like that, you realize what would happen. There would be things in this life that some objects would be sharp, and we need them to be sharp and hard, but immediately if they were going to hurt somebody, they become soft and pliable and dull. In other words, our world would not be predictable. There'd be nothing safe. There'd be nothing sure in this world. There'd be nothing that you could bank on. There'd be no such thing as science because you couldn't test anything because everything's in flux. And even more important than that, if there's never any real danger, if there's never a reason for anybody to ever consider being hurt or being in need, then you know what? There's never a reason to be concerned about anybody else. Because if there's no real need, there's never any motivation to reach out and help anybody. Which means things that you and I know make this world what it is today. It makes you and I the kind of people God wants us to be. It makes you a truly good person. Things like generosity, kindness, unselfishness, empathy, even love are completely meaningless in a world where it's designed to keep us safe and bring us pleasure at every moment. There would be none of the moral qualities that you and I would all agree make us truly good people. I mean, until I studied for this message, I hadn't really thought about it that way. Maybe you haven't either. I once heard it said this way: God is way more interested in our character than he is in our comfort. See, precisely because God is loving, he's a loving Father, he chooses something different than giving you and I constant pleasure and no pain. God leads us into a world where we all have the freedom to choose whatever path we want to take. He lets us stand up. He lets us walk on our own. And he knows the dangers that lie ahead of us. But he allows us to participate in forming our own character. And he knows this process often involves struggling and suffering and pain. But even then, God still takes the risk. Because he knows that without that, we, ourselves, and this world that we live in become something different than God ever intended for them to be. It's fascinating when you start to think about it that way. Now, I want to shift gears for a moment and say something right here. So far, everything that I've said to you up to this point is all philosophy. It's all intellectual. It's all, answering questions and all that stuff. And I imagine for some of you who came here today, you loved it. I mean, this is why you wanted to come. You wanted to hear stuff like that. And maybe for those of you who do have faith in God, you at least now when a friend asks you, why do bad things happen? You've like, well, I got some answers. You know, they may not be great answers all the time. They may not answer every question, but man, at least I've got something to say. And you've really enjoyed that part. But I have to say, I've sat in emergency rooms. I've sat in intensive care units. I've stood beside people in funeral homes, in cemeteries. I've cried with parents who've buried their children. I myself have been one of those parents. I buried my son. And the one thing that I've learned is that when you're in that place, there are no answers. No good ones. Because answers and intellectual arguments and philosophical stuff, they don't help when you're in that place. I think it's funny. I don't think I've ever had anybody ask me to explain to them the philosophical question of why God allows pain and suffering in this world when they're going through pain and suffering. I've been with people in every kind of tragedy you can think of. Man, I've seen people in car accidents, drug overdoses, suicide, crime, homelessness, poverty, divorce, hunger, you name it. Nobody in those situations ever want me to sit down and talk to them about intellectual arguments. They don't care. Because when your world's crumbling and it's all falling apart around you, you don't want answers. You don't need answers. You're not concerned with the why. The why questions, most often the why questions come from those of us who are on the outside looking in, the observers. We all ask the why questions. Because when you're in the midst of suffering, you don't care about why. Because even if you did know why, would it matter? Does it help you feel better? Does it take the pain away? Does it make it hurt less? And see, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I know in a church our size, with as many people watching me or listening to me here today, some of you are right in the middle of it. You're suffering. You're in pain. You're hurting. And you're wondering, how in the world am I going to get through this? And you've been sitting here listening to me, and you've heard all the arguments, and you're thinking to yourself, none of this helps. It doesn't help me one single bit. I mean, I'm glad you've got reasons. I'm glad you've got answers to the questions, but I don't need reasons. I don't need answers. I need help. I get that. Because when you're hurting, the answer is not why. The answer is not a what. The answer is a who. See, over the years, walking with people through tragedy in life and having a few of my own, I have just come to believe when you find yourself in the middle of a painful circumstance, when you experience suffering in this life, you really have two choices. And it's only two. The first choice, well, you can decide what Charles Templeton decided. That in a world like this, filled with pain and tragedy, there can't possibly be a loving God to turn to. There can't possibly be a greater purpose underneath all of this pain. And you just decide that what I see and what I experience in this world, that is all there is. This is as good as it's ever going to get from me. So I'm just going to never hope in the present, and I'm certainly not going to hope for the future. I'm just going to live in the now. In the time that I'm here on this planet, I'm going to make it the best I can. I'm going to avoid pain whenever possible. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to enjoy life as much as I can, because I know when it's over, it's over. And then there's another choice. I love the way the writer C.S. Lewis said it. He said that whenever you find something in this life, a desire in this world that you just can't fulfill. In other words, if this life or this existence is ultimately disappointing to you, unsatisfying to you, he says the most likely explanation for that is you weren't made for this world. And he says when you realize that you were not made for this world, your focus shifts. And you realize, even in the middle of the worst tragedy, I know this is not how the story is going to end. Because the story is being written still, and it's leading me somewhere. There is a powerful, loving Father in heaven, and he is telling his story throughout history. And I'm only a part of that story, but ultimately he's leading me and this entire world to a new place. It's a better place, a better world. Jesus said it this way. He said, I've told you these things so that in me you can have peace. In this world, you'll have trouble. Now this is fascinating if you think about it. Even Jesus, Son of God, never envisioned a world without pain and suffering. Never said it. In fact, Jesus promised the exact opposite. Jesus said, take it to the bank. There will be trouble. See, a lot of people say there's two things that are sure in life. It's death and taxes. Jesus said, no, I got a third. It's called trouble. Take it to the bank. You're going to have trouble through this life. Trouble today, trouble tomorrow. You're going to have trouble. But I want you to have some peace. To which you're thinking, peace? I mean, you just said I'm going to have trouble all the time, pain and suffering. How can I have peace? Jesus says, here's how. In this world you'll have trouble, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. Jesus overcame this fallen world that we live in. This world of hurt and disappointment and pain and suffering. Not by taking the suffering out of this world. That was not his plan. His plan was to enter into the world himself. There's a brilliant writer named John Stott. He just passed away recently, but I love the way he writes it. And I'm going to read you his words. Here's what he says. He says, I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries, and I've stood respectfully before the statue of Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing round his mouth, a remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time, after a while, I have had to turn away. And in imagination, I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross. Nails through his hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from thorn pricks, mouth dry, intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood, tears and death. He suffered for us. Our suffering become more manageable in light of his. There is still a question mark against human suffering, but over it, we boldly stamp another mark. The cross, which symbolizes divine suffering. The cross of Christ. Our powerful, loving God decided he could not leave us here alone in a sin-stained world with pain and suffering all around us. But instead of taking the pain out, he came in. He came to us. And not even just that, he became one of us. The God of the universe gave up the privileges of being God. He wrapped himself in skin and bones and flesh. He who was above death, who was above pain, allowed his own body to be bruised, to be beaten, to be pierced. And in those moments, as Jesus hung on the cross, God allowed his Son to experience the entire weight of the suffering that sin causes in our world, even though he didn't deserve it. Jesus never did anything to deserve it. He never did anything wrong. He never sinned, but he still bore the consequences of sin for us. And I find this good news. Even when Jesus was suffering, he asked questions, just like you do, just like I do. He said, God, why? Why have you forsaken me? Why have you allowed this to happen? And yet God still watched his son suffer. And his heart was breaking. But God also knew that the story was not finished. There was something better to come. That even in the midst of the suffering, the story was yet to be told. It wasn't finished yet. God knew resurrection's coming. One day everything was going to be finished. And everything would be made right. And death would be defeated. And sin would be powerless. And suffering and pain one day would finally be over. So that's the hope that we have in a world full of suffering. So I'll say it again. The answer to your pain is not a what. It's not a why. It's a who. And his name is Jesus. And he suffered for you. And when you suffer, he suffers with you. Let's bow our heads and pray. God, I thank you that you're all powerful and you're all loving. You loved us so much that you gave us a free will, and you left us in a world where we could be everything that you dreamed for us to be, even though that had some consequences, and even though we chose the opposite. But God, I'm so thankful that you're not a God who's detached from suffering, but that you experience it with us. You came and through Christ, you suffered for us. And now when we suffer, you're with us, and your heart breaks, and you're walking with us through it. God, I pray that hope will sustain the people here today who may be suffering, who may be in pain, who may be struggling with things. And God, may they know the peace that comes from knowing that through it all, you have overcome the world. And one day, it'll all be over. God, while we exist in this world, fill us with that hope. And I pray for people who are yet to find that they're still struggling with all these questions, that they're still asking. And God, they're yet to make a decision to turn their lives over to you, to trust you for life and salvation. That God, through something that happens in this series, something that happens in their life even, they would be drawn to you, and they would come to that place, that they would talk to someone before they leave, that they would make the decision to give their lives to you. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.